Immediately grasping central territory, this pawn opens diagonal lines for your queen and bishop, dictating early piece development. Mirroring white's advance immediately contests the center and opens lines for rapid piece development. Developing the knight now immediately challenges black's central pawn and prepares to castle, setting a dynamic tone for the game. Developing your knight to the active c6 square reinforces the central pawn and prepares for queen and bishop development, setting a solid foundation for the game. Initiating the Ruy-Lopez, this bishop deployment immediately pressures black's knight, hinting at future central pawn advances and a potential kingside assault. Challenging the bishop's influence, black begins to question white's pawn structure and aims for queenside expansion. Preserving the bishop's diagonal keeps pressure on black's center and potential kingside threats alive. Challenging the bishop's position, this pawn advance creates immediate tension and expands black's queenside space. Preserving the bishop's scope on the long diagonal, white avoids immediate pawn exchanges and maintains pressure. Shifting the knight to the rim aims to disrupt white's bishop pair and prepare a queenside pawn storm, though it surrenders some central influence for now. Casting the king to safety secures the monarch and prepares to activate the rook, a classic defensive maneuver that now allows white to focus on developing the queenside and challenging black's aggressive pawn thrusts. Black solidifies the pawn chain, preparing to develop the bishop and contest the center. This subtle repositioning of the central pawn aims to free up the c8 bishop for active participation in the game, potentially targeting white's kingside or supporting a central pawn thrust later. It's a measured step, prioritizing structural integrity over immediate fireworks. Seizing central space and opening lines for attack, this advance immediately challenges black's pawn structure and aims to exploit the kingside. Challenging the bishop's influence in the center, this exchange aims to disrupt white's piece harmony and seize more central space for black's pawns. It opens lines and creates potential outpost opportunities for the knight, though it does concede the bishop pair for the moment. Opening the file dramatically shifts the focus, creating immediate pressure down that edge while simultaneously liberating the queen's diagonal. Consider how this action might draw black's attention and potentially disrupt their castled king's safety later on, forcing a defensive posture. Securing the knight's retreat, black now aims to shore up their central pawn structure, but this advance leaves the kingside slightly more exposed to future attacks, a potential weakness to monitor. Opening the c-file aims to exploit black's slightly uncoordinated pieces and create dynamic play, potentially pressuring the weak b5 pawn and challenging control of the center. Anchoring the bishop to its new diagonal aims to reinforce the central pawn structure and potentially pressure white's queenside pawn majority, while also preparing for future piece activity. Initiating central control with the knight, this repositioning aims to challenge black's pawn structure and potentially exploit the weakened kingside squares after the f6 advance. Developing the knight to e7 strategically shores up the pawn chain and prepares for potential kingside castling, a welcome contrast to the previously isolated a5 knight's position. The queen's repositioning now aims to support the central pawn push and prepare for a potential kingside assault. Black solidifies the pawn chain, preparing to potentially challenge white's queenside space advantage and create a more robust defensive structure against further central advances. Unlocking the d-file presents white with immediate central pressure and potential attacking opportunities down the open corridor, while black's knights, somewhat passive, are challenged to find active squares. The queen's repositioning aims to challenge the central pawn structure and potentially eye the queenside. Centralizing the bishop on e3 marshals the piece towards the kingside, aiming to bolster white's attacking potential while simultaneously preparing for potential pawn advances on the kingside or a more direct assault on black's defenses. The knight's journey to g6 aims to contest the dark squares and potentially prepare for a kingside advance, though it temporarily neglects development and creates a somewhat passive outpost for the knight. Securing the open c-file with a rook prepares for potential pawn breakthroughs or rapid cavalry deployment, simultaneously reinforcing the central pressure and creating a flexible battery with the queen. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queen side disrupts white's coordination, aiming to dislodge the vulnerable bishop and potentially open lines for counterplay, though it does sacrifice some queenside pawn structure integrity. Shifting the knight to a4 aims to contest the file and potentially pressure black's queenside pawn structure, while also clearing the way for the c-pawn to advance. Black daringly fractures their pawn structure to gain dynamic play on the queen side, aiming to open lines for counterplay. Striking at the center opens up avenues for your pieces and challenges black's pawn structure, aiming to dismantle their defenses before they can fully consolidate. The pawn structure now offers black a potential target on the now open d-file, but it also opens up the c-file for white's rook, creating a dynamic tension where control of that open corridor will be paramount in the coming skirmishes. Focusing the queen on the kingside attack is a bold choice, potentially setting up a devastating assault by concentrating forces against black's somewhat exposed monarch. Initiating the rook to the b-file anticipates a potential pawn thrust or aims to challenge white's control over that open column, creating dynamic possibilities and forcing white to consider defensive adjustments. Disrupting black's pawn structure, this advance creates immediate pressure on the d6 pawn and aims to exploit the light square weaknesses that are becoming apparent on the queen side. Bringing the bishop to e7 solidifies the kingside defense, preparing for potential castling and reinforcing the knight's position, while also freeing the f8 square for the rook, hinting at a desire to activate that piece. Unleashing a powerful knight to the d5 outpost disrupts black's central pawn structure and creates significant attacking potential against the kingside, especially as the black king currently lacks adequate defensive coverage. Sensing the encroaching knight on d5 and the potential threat to the queen side, the black queen gracefully retreats to c6, offering a defensive post and eyeing the central squares with renewed purpose. Recentering the queen on its home rank offers a flexible retreat, preparing to redeploy to either the queen side or king side depending on black's next action, while also safeguarding against potential discovery threats. Reclaiming influence over the d6 square, the bishop now eyes the long diagonal, creating an intricate web of threats and counter-threats, forcing white to constantly reevaluate potential sacrifices and pawn breaks. Preparing to contest the d-file, white aims to increase pressure on black's queenside structure and potentially exchange off the active black bishop. Black's decision to occupy the c8 square with the rook, even with the d-file temporarily blocked by white's advanced knight, signals an intent to contest the open file and potentially activate the rook on the queen side, while simultaneously preparing for further pawn advances or piece repositioning. The open d-file now presents itself as a primary theater of operations, and placing a rook there, even temporarily, signals an intent to contest it forcefully, possibly preparing for a later advance or supporting a central push. Reclaiming the bishop's vital diagonal, this maneuver seeks to re-establish peace harmony on the queen side and prepare for a potential pawn push, a necessary counterpoint to white's increasing central pressure. Sensing an opportunity, white redirects the knight towards the kingside, subtly preparing to reinforce the d-pawn and potentially create threats against black's somewhat exposed monarch, while also freeing up the rook on d1 to engage on a more active file. A strategic redirection is underway as black's queen abandons the relative safety of the queen side to embark on a reconnaissance mission toward the king side, potentially eyeing white's slightly exposed monarch. Repositioning the knight to f1, a seemingly passive retreat, masterfully prepares for a potential repositioning to g3 or h2, aiming to solidify the king's defenses and potentially join an attack on the king side. This subtle maneuver also opens the d-file for the rook and frees up the e2 square for the queen, creating new avenues of pressure. Castling to safety, black finally secures their monarch, a crucial defensive maneuver after a series of positional skirmishes that have left both sides jockeying for control. Recentralizing the knight to ng3 offers better control over the king side, aiming to reinforce the g2 square and potentially launch a future attack on black's somewhat exposed monarch, while also freeing up the f1 square for potential piece repositioning. Harnessing the knight's potential on f4, black immediately confronts the centralized white queen and aims to disrupt white's developing harmony. Sacrificing the bishop opens up the g-file with immediate consequence for black's king, though it also grants white some positional concessions in the center. The unleashed pressure aims to capitalize on any defensive oversight by the opponent. Black seizes the initiative, a sharp tactical thrust opening the e-file and creating immediate pressure on white's central pawn structure, while simultaneously untangling the knight and activating the bishop. A calculated gamble to exploit the slightly exposed black monarch, rerouting the knight to a more aggressive square, potentially creating new avenues of attack. Initiating the counteroffensive on the open files, this maneuver seeks to leverage the newly established rooks for greater influence. Initiating a powerful central assault, white's knight repositions for a decisive strike. This maneuver aims to exploit black's slightly exposed king by creating new attacking diagonals and reinforcing the kingside pressure. The doubled pawns on the kingside, while a potential weakness, now offer white a clearer path to develop attacking pieces. The pawn on f4 will now be well supported and could become a strong outpost. Black must be acutely aware of the increased danger to their monarch and consider defensive resources. Releasing the pinned bishop is the immediate priority, but the resulting pawn structure with doubled e-pawns creates significant long-term weaknesses. Reclaiming the outpost and forcing a pawn exchange opens up the f-file, putting pressure on black's king. Pouncing on the undefended pawn, black injects immediate tactical chaos, forcing white to confront a potential disruption of their pawn structure and exposure of their king's immediate vicinity. Unleashing a timely rook maneuver, white aims to exploit the open central files and pressure black's somewhat exposed monarch, potentially opening avenues for the queen and knights to join the fray. Black's queen now retreats to a more secure square, abandoning the central open file and preparing to defend the vulnerable kingside. Sharpening the attack, this piece sacrifice aims to pry open the kingside and disrupt black's defensive structure. Seeking to dislodge the aggressive rook from the vital 6th rank, black's queen repositions, preparing to defend its weakened king and contest the open files, a delicate balancing act amidst the storm of attacking pieces. Unlocking the h-file could offer white crucial attacking potential against black's exposed monarch, a welcome prospect given the otherwise locked central positions. Gaining a pawn and potentially opening up the g-file offers exciting prospects for counterplay, but it must be carefully managed to avoid creating lasting weaknesses around your king. Unlocking the d-file for your rook creates immediate pressure, potentially disrupting black's king's safety and forcing concessions. Recognizing the encroaching danger, black wisely prioritizes protecting their monarch, sacrificing a pawn to dislodge the aggressive rook and gain vital breathing room. The white queen now pierces the black position, directly challenging the vulnerable king and potentially opening lines for further assault. The queen's sacrifice is accepted, initiating a swift transition towards an endgame where the rook now stands in a precarious forward position, aiming to exploit the open file and challenge white's king. Unleashing a decisive rook check, white boldly seizes the open 8th rank, forcing the black king into a precarious central position and initiating a swift endgame transition where material advantage looms large. The king's shield crumbles, leaving the monarch exposed on the open file, a stark testament to the cost of advancing pieces too eagerly. Unleashing a decisive knight fork, this maneuver directly targets the beleaguered black king and its surrounding defenses, forcing a cascade of critical decisions.